and it's finally here. The long-awaited successor of the Jet Set Radio series has finally touched ground. Team Reptile's Bomb Rush CyberFunk is here and it's ready to blow you away. I've been looking forward to this game since I picked up wind of its release from a Hideki Naganuma tweet years ago. I'm not one to follow a game's development too closely and usually wait until it's actually been released, but this was one exception I had to make, and I gobbled up every media release related to this game. I was just so pumped. Being a huge fan of the Jet Set Radio series, and more importantly, a Naganuma stan, I've been clamoring at Sega for over a decade to make a follow-up to Jet Set Radio Future. And boy, after playing Bomb Rush CyberFunk, they really missed the ball by not following that game up. We're going to get into it, but let me first start this off by saying that Bomb Rush CyberFunk takes everything that Jet Set Radio does and brings it to the modern era with absolute finesse. It's an incredibly rare experience that a clone of a game surpasses the legacy of its inspiration, let alone completely redefines what makes it so great in the first place. And Bomb Rush CyberFunk does exactly that. The story of Team Reptile's masterpiece begins many years ago in the year 2000 when Sega released Jet Set Radio, or Jet Grind Radio depending on your geography. The game captivated audiences with its fast-paced, inline skating madness, and most importantly, is one of the most creative and artistic games of all time. It was one of the first games to feature the cel-shading graphic style, and most importantly, its soundtrack was out of this world. Directed by Hideki Naganuma, a central character to this tale, the music featured in this game was something I had never heard before nor since, until Bomb Rush CyberFunk, that is. The gameplay of Jet Set Radio was wildly addictive, and the story, while relatively shallow, was interesting and creative. The game would see enough success that it would get a follow-up in the name of Jet Set Radio Future for the original Xbox. This is where Sega really showed off how they mastered everything that they did right in the first place. While it was coined a sequel, it really felt like a reimagining or a remaster in some ways. Like its predecessor, it successfully caught audiences' attention to the point that it easily developed a cult following. However, unfortunately, this is where the Jet Set Radio saga would come to a tragic end for seemingly no reason other than Sega didn't feel like making more games in the series, and it's not like fans haven't been clamoring at their feet ever since. And now that BRC is out, it's clear they dropped the ball on that one. In the years of Sega's neglect of the franchise, fans would eventually find a hero in Hideki Naganuma. You see, while everything in Jet Set Radio is amazing, top-tier gaming, it was its soundtrack that really left a lasting impression on audiences. Because Sega wasn't listening, people turned their heads towards Naganuma, who, at the time, was really powerless to get fans a whole new entry to the Jet Set Radio franchise. At this point in his career, he was mostly doing freelance work, including some tracks for Hover, which was another Jet Set Radio influenced experience, which is actually quite good, so you should check that out too. He also worked on Lethal League Blaze, which coincidentally was also developed by Team Reptile. I couldn't dredge out many details about how the idea for Bomb Rush CyberFunk came about, but in my head I think it played out something like this. Naganuma was working for Team Reptile at the time on titles like Lethal League Blaze. All the while, fans were screaming at him for a new Jet Set Radio game, and maybe he pitched the idea to Team Reptile. Or perhaps Team Reptile already had their sights on Jet Set Radio, and Naganuma would prove to be a valuable addition to the project. Regardless of where the inspiration came from, it would eventually culminate in the development of Bomb Rush CyberFunk. The fact that Hideki Naganuma was already doing work with Team Reptile at the time of their announcement just seems way too coincidental to me, and so the most logical explanation would be that it came from his court. Needless to say, when this game was announced, fans around the world, myself included, were just astounded and on the edge with excitement. Upon its announcement, it was initially slated for a 2022 release. However, as the release date drew nearer, Team Reptile would make the ultimate decision to postpone the release of the game to summer 2023. Whenever this happens, it is definitely a tough decision to make, but I'd like to think, especially in this case, it's always for the better. If you feel your game is unfinished before you release it, you pull the plug right away and you make sure it's complete before you do. And now the long-awaited day has finally arrived. Bomb Rush CyberFunk released the 18th of August, 2023, and let me tell you, I've never seen a spiritual successor that was this connected to the original. This game is so faithful that I wouldn't be surprised if Sega didn't have the grounds to sue for copyright infringement. Hopefully they don't, and to be fair, I'm sure fair use is at play here. The high adrenaline, off-the-walls, inline skating gameplay makes a huge comeback, and it's as addictive as ever. This time around also, it has the added bonus of featuring parkour, skateboarding, and BMXing, all of which play identical to each other, but adds some much needed flair to the gameplay experience, and expands what one would expect from a Jet Set Radio successor. The gameplay loop is much the same as fans experienced in Jet Set Radio. Players will skate, bike, or parkour their gang's way through various hoods in New Amsterdam, graffiti tagging the ops, and eventually challenging them for dominance of the hood. As players conquer each neighborhood, the narrative progresses steadily to eventual conclusion. The level design in Bomb Rush CyberFunk is totally on par with Tokyoto's design from Jet Set Radio Future. Truthfully, I do prefer the world of Tokyoto, but Bomb Rush CyberFunk has a lot to offer as well, and serves as a natural extension of the world that Smilebit created all those years ago. The now famous cel-shaded art style makes a triumphant return this time, with incredible polish that really brings this gaming style to life. There's something to be said about settling with this kind of art style in the contemporary era, in the face of incredibly powerful technology, not to mention gamers' demand for realistic graphics. Furthermore, because of its lack of complexity, it is less resource intensive, as something say like realism. I also find that choosing these kinds of styles gives the game much more character, and in this particular case, while it clings to its inspirations, it still succeeds in pushing the beauty of cel shading. At least in my opinion too, I find that these art styles age better, because they don't take a hardcore approach to the graphics and really carve a personality for themselves. The more realistic the graphical style, the more it seems to hang on the threads of believability and immersion. Whereas the art style of games like Jet Set Radio are clearly from the outset a game. In the case of Bomb Rush CyberFunk 2, the art style was central to the legacy they were trying to build upon, and so it was crucial that they get it right, and boy does Team Reptile bring out the beauty of the cel shading art style. Of course, like everything else in this game, the narrative tips its hat hard to Jet Set Radio at every turn. In JSR, the narrative felt like it was an excuse for the gameplay to unfold, and while serviceable, it wasn't anything to scoff at. CyberFunk, on the other hand, seeks to take similar themes and expand upon and flesh out their narrative further. Taking place in a futuristic city called New Amsterdam, gangs of so-called writers compete with one another through graffiti, athleticism, and style to conquer turf and claim the title of All City. Continuing the thread of legacy building, in Jet Set Radio the gangs were called Rudies. The central antagonist was generally speaking the Rikaku police, and the opposing gangs in the city. All the main characters in JSR were pretty fleshed out for the scope of the game, and Bomb Rush CyberFunk seeks to validate the very same principle. The primary antagonist is undoubtedly the New Amsterdam police, who are trying to shut down writers for good. Of course, the gangs serve as a secondary antagonist to our heroes, the Bomb Rush crew. As part of the expanded narrative, plot twists are introduced and work out quite well. I won't spoil anything, but about 2/3 into the game, the developers drop a big twist into the mix. The changes to the plot also include dream or nightmare sequences that protagonist Red goes through in search of his true self. These sections of the game are a real highlight as the level design is second to none. Some provide a real challenge, and it's totally a sight to behold with the art in these sections. To me, it felt like a Psychonauts crossover because you have to navigate these acid trip-like levels. They'll leave you wanting more by the end because they only dot the gaming experience. The bulk of it is definitely in the hoods. Surely any conversation about Bomb Rush CyberFunk, let alone anything Jet Set Radio related, is never complete without talking about the music. As I mentioned, this time around, Hideki Naganuma had his inputs on the soundtrack. However, instead of Naganuma nearly exclusively developing the soundtrack, it features many other artists, which works tirelessly to expand on the soundscape of its inspiration, Jet Set Radio. Of course, Naganuma's tracks are out of this world, and totally on par with everything he's ever done. While his work is incredible, it is so nice to see all these other artists able to have their own unique sound which further fleshes out the world and feeling of Bomb Rush CyberFunk. In my opinion, going with a more expansive soundtrack, that is, including more artists than a handful, helps BRC feel like its own game, separate from JSR. Of course, it is intrinsically intertwined with Jet Set Radio, but it is different enough that it carves its own identity, while still remaining true to its inspirations. Undoubtedly, much like its predecessor, the music is central to the experience that Bomb Rush CyberFunk provides. Like any game worthy of entering the annals of gaming legends, the gameplay is the shining factor of Bomb Rush CyberFunk. As I'm sure you've picked up on by now, especially if you've played Jet Set Radio, you know what you're in store for. But if you haven't, let me tell you, its high adrenaline arcade style inline skating will hook you from the first grind, and this bite is deep, folks. It's a system that is easy to pick up and relatively difficult to master, and regardless of your skill level, always manages to look stunning, which further adds to its addictive nature. The whole premise is to select whether you'll be skateboarding, parkouring, inline skating, or biking. This selection is purely aesthetic, as each style handles the exact same, save for parkour, which is the only exception, and it is simply just a slower way of navigating. Using these skills, you grind, wall ride, and perform various other tricks to navigate the plethora of levels, finding the graffiti tags of enemy gangs scattered throughout and replacing them with your own beautiful art. As you progress through the hood with your graffiti, you will eventually challenge the controlling gang for dominance of the hood. These challenges play out as a series of mini-games ranging from score battles to races. These games culminate in one defining battle where each crew works to rack up as many points as they can to out-earn their opponents. It's very easy, and by the end, I had only failed one battle with the final crew, Futurism, and it's clear that difficulty isn't a main feature of the game. Which I guess brings me to my complaints. If I could harp on one thing about the game, it would be that it's too perfect of a clone to Jet Set Radio Future. It's not a huge problem for me, and I might be grasping at straws trying to make this argument, but while it adds skateboarding and BMXing and parkour, it does little in the way of expanding the Jet Set Radio formula. The game is nearly a one-to-one recreation of the original experience, which is fine if that's what you were expecting, but potentially to those who are seeking a broader Jet Set Radio-like universe may be disappointed. Secondly, the game felt much shorter than Jet Set Radio Future, and by the end just leaves you wanting more. This could be explained by the fact that because it's so close to the original, and we're so used to that style of gameplay by now, we're already primed for this kind of gaming experience. I guess it leaves room for a follow-up, but especially for a nearly full-priced release, the content feels like it's lacking in volume. That being said, it is definitely a fully fledged game. I just feel like there could have been more of it. In my experience, I beat the game in 4.5 hours, and by the end wish it was closer to 10. For me, it hits all the right buttons, though because I wanted an experience exactly like Jet Set Radio Future, and so truthfully, I struggle finding too much wrong with this game. Perhaps the most important thing about Bomb Rush CyberFunk is that because it is so good, the game feels like nostalgia realized. Cleverly hidden under the well-crafted gameplay is an experience deeply rooted in nostalgia, yet easily manages to not be held back by these foundations. The fact that it's not a remaster and instead a total sole successor, developed by an entirely different production team, spearheaded by wild fans, points to the capabilities of nostalgia. This is also critical in expanding the reminiscent experience and bringing it to the present. Nostalgia as a feeling often comes up short, but when infused to projects in this way, it uses it as fuel to develop something entirely new and fresh. Bomb Rush CyberFunk excels in this regard, and surely gaming would be a lesser medium without it. Overall, I'm beyond pleased with Bomb Rush CyberFunk. Team Reptile set out to continue a legacy and bring it to the modern era, that being of Jet Set Radio, and they really deliver a top-tier package. Of course, especially if you're a fan of Jet Set Radio, you'll struggle to find anything wrong with this game other than the fact it leaves you wanting more, which is, especially by today's standards, a good problem to have. Everything established all those years ago with Jet Set Radio is even more fleshed out and ends up making Bomb Rush CyberFunk feel like a natural follow-up to Smilebit's masterpiece. The world, the characters, the art, the music, everything makes a grandiose comeback, and it's better than it's ever been. Whether or not you're a fan of JSR, Bomb Rush CyberFunk is certainly worth your time, and because it's so good, I guess fans will have to clamor at Team Reptile instead of Sega now for future additions to the amazing gameplay experience that they've created. Once again, as always, thank you so much for watching. I'm excited to talk about this game in the comments, so let me know what you thought. Also, if you want to watch my video about Jet Set Radio, it'll be in the description. Leave a like if you liked the video, a dislike if you disliked it, and I hope to see you in the next one. Take care.